America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, we're joined by George Landrith. George is the president of the Frontiers of Freedom and an esteemed constitutional law expert. He's released his compelling new book, Let Freedom Ring Again. The book addresses the pressing need to preserve America's founding principles of freedom and prosperity amidst growing threats to our civil liberties and constitutional government. George, welcome to Main Street Matters. Thanks for joining us.
It is great to be with you. A real honor. Thank you. I admire the work that you guys do and the perspective you bring to the work you do, because heaven knows we need more of that.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's interesting. I think this book, that the timing is perfect. You could even claim overdue, because I just want to share a quick personal story. I kind of feel like patriotism is, I always felt like this, that patriotism is really equated to one party, Republicans. But I had it confirmed over the 4th of July weekend when I was with my daughter, who's in her early 20s. And I was at her house, and she had bought a bunch of 4th of July decorations for her house that was outside versus just inside. And she goes, "Okay, Mom, all my neighbors are going to think I'm a Republican now." And I said, "So having decorations up celebrating the 4th of July is equated with being a Republican?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, everyone's going to think we're a Republican now." And I was like, "Don't you think that's kind of sad that that's where we're at?" So hats off to you for writing that book, because that's our younger generation. And my daughter is fairly conservative, to be honest with you. But that is what she's being exposed to on a regular basis. So tell us about the book in general and what prompted you to write it.
Well, the subtitle, for example, is "Can Self-Evident Truths Save America from Further Decline?" And I believe the answer to that question is yes. Part of our nation's problem is that we've begun to separate ourselves from these self-evident truths that we once didn't used to be. Like the story you just told about your daughter. A generation ago, I don't think that's how it was. And what I mean by that is a generation ago, putting the flag out on the 4th of July or having 4th of July decorations in your yard and in your house, those kinds of things did not distinguish between the two parties. If you look at someone like, for example, John F. Kennedy, he told a great story about when he told a bunch of people who were visiting the White House to be honored because they'd won a Nobel Prize. And he told them, never has there been a collection of intelligence like there is today here in the White House, except for when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not a story they'd tell today. Today, what they'd tell you is we need to take all those statues down and get rid of them. We need to change all the high schools named after him. So something's changed, and that's a real problem. And as we get away from self-evident truths, the concepts in our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution, we see a decline in our nation. Not just a civic decline, not just an economic decline, but a cultural decline as well. So it's really sad that it's impacting us in so many different ways. And I also would argue we see a national security decline. If you look today, we won the Cold War. It was supposed to be a safer world, and now it's not. And why is that? Because we have separated ourselves from these self-evident truths. So as I saw this happening, I said, I want to write a book that will maybe help America wake up from its civic slumber and realize that these principles matter. They're not old-fashioned, they're time-tested.
Is it the infiltration from, I don't know if infiltration is a more too dramatic of a word, but for lack of a better term, the infiltration of outside forces that are indoctrinating our kids? I mean, we used to kind of see it in Hollywood on a continuous basis in the videos and how they would portray certain events that they would cover. I can't even think of an example right now, but it was usually always making one side the sort of the evil villain. And it tended to usually be conservatives, Republicans, capitalists, large companies. They were always the evil villain hurting the innocent victims, no matter what. But now, and then we saw it, colleges became the indoctrinating cesspool across the country. But now we know it's happening, particularly post-COVID, is happening at all grade levels, starting at kindergarten. Where do you think it's coming from? Is it outside forces, inside forces? Is it the propaganda just coming from, oozing out from everywhere, outside of the country, inside the country?
Well, ultimately, I think it's coming from, if you will, the extreme left. And it used to be that in America, we were, there wasn't really, example, if you go back to John F. Kennedy's time, it's when I was very young. I was like a toddler. I have very few memories of that time. But the reality was there wasn't really an extreme left that was prevalent in politically or otherwise in America. And if you go back far enough, you see that you had, for example, people like, Jimmy Stewart and other pretty famous actors who served in the military, gave up their movie career for years to be pilots and fly bombing missions during World War II, etc. And I don't think you see that much anymore. So something's changed. Something has happened dramatically. And I would argue that the left has been doing a good job, whether it was the communists trying to infiltrate us as they did the FDR administration with people like Alger Hiss and others, and our educational system. But something's happened to where now all of a sudden socialism and communism are not dirty words anymore. I remember as a kid calling someone a communist or a socialist was kind of like, it was a bad word. It was kind of like mean. Like, why would you call them that? And now all of a sudden it's kind of like there are people who embrace the word. We have members of Congress who embrace the idea, I am a socialist. And I'm thinking to myself, what happened? The record of socialism is horrific. And the proof's in the pudding. So this isn't just about kind of like, oh, he's just an ideologue. It's like, no, I'm just about practicality. What works?
George, you see what's really interesting lately is the left is trying to co-opt this word freedom. Kamala Harris's launch video, for instance, was all about defending freedom. So can you take a minute and describe how you define freedom and the real definition of freedom versus kind of the left's co-opted definition?
Well, I think freedom has some interesting points because, for example, I don't have the freedom to go over and murder my neighbor. So freedom doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. It means you can do whatever you want as long as you're not harming other people. But the left likes to have this harm be kind of like, if I have a gasoline lawnmower, I'm harming them. And it's like, actually, no. So we have to kind of understand what we mean by actual harm. We used to have a standard where that was kind of obvious. And they're to the point now where if I have a different political opinion than them, somehow I'm harming them. So they've kind of, if you will, destroyed the definition of freedom. Freedom basically to them means you have the freedom to agree with us and you have the freedom to empower us. And if you don't, then basically you've got to go and you don't have freedom. So I think it's just a weird world we live in because our founders understood what freedom meant. It meant that you had the right to live, you had the right to pursue happiness, you had the right to own property. These are, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are things that mattered. But what you didn't have the right to do is to harm other people in a traditional sense, not disagree with them. And government's job wasn't to make everything, this utopia garbage. that never works out. Every leftist who's ever lived, who attained power, has promised a utopian society. And what have they provided? A hellhole. So that's the lie that left tells. And that's the lie, quite frankly, that Kamala Harris is telling. She, for example, when she was state attorney general, was very avidly and very interested in violating the rights of certain people that would help her political career. And she was found guilty of violating the law, violating the Constitution, and of course nothing was done because, after all, she comes from the left and they're allowed to do that.
Right. There are many threats that I see to our freedom today, whether it's the debasement of our currency, outrageous taxation, regulations, just constant regulations. What do you see as the biggest threats to freedom today?
Well, I think that you've hit on several of them. I think it's hard to argue that it's just one, because I feel like we're on a battlefield surrounded by, if you will, enemies of freedom. So it's hard to say it's any one of the people surrounding us or the forces surrounding us. It's quite a few, and you've named many of them. I would argue that a denial of history is also part of the problem, because part of the purpose of getting us to decide that our founding fathers were all bad people and their statues should be torn down is an effort to essentially separate us from our Constitution. And our Constitution essentially guided us from being 13 insignificant colonies compared to, say, Europe, economically, militarily, etc. And in the space of roughly 100 years, we became the world's economic superpower. And then a few years later, we're recognized widely as the world's military superpower. And why was that? Well, it's because our Constitution was designed to unleash the innovation, the freedom, the ability of people to make the world a better place. It didn't rely on command and control systems, which essentially hold you down and prevent you from the real success that you can have. I remember an interesting story one time, and Steve Jobs of Apple was a liberal, but he was speaking with Barack Obama, explaining to him that if he were starting Apple in that time, in other words, in the 2000s, instead of in the 1970s, in his father's garage, he couldn't do it. That the regulatory regime, the tax regime, and everything else would make it so that he could not create Apple computer. And what's interesting is it started off a teenager in his dad's garage. And it is today, depending on what day it is and what the market value is, either the biggest or one of the 2 or 3 biggest companies in the world. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's a great thing that America allows that to happen. And yet he's pointing out, a liberal pointing out to another liberal, Steve Jobs to Barack Obama, hey, guy, this is not working. We are not going to have any more Apples created. And I feel like that's a problem. You guys at the Job Creators Network, I'm sure, can see that. It's kind of like going to the Olympics wearing concrete boots. I don't think the runner wearing concrete boots is going to win the 100-yard dash, even if he's the fastest human being on the planet. You can hold people down and you can prevent them from success. And that's what big government does, and that's what they're doing.
Jordan talked about the left co-opting the word freedom. I think that they are experts in the language that they use and how they either co-opt or kind of rebrand or redefine things. And I'll give you a couple of examples. During COVID, when scientists, respected scientists or doctors had different opinions about COVID or about vaccines or anything like that, regardless of what, people's opinions are, it was deemed misinformation. That's how they described it. That was code for, it's a lie. And we saw this attack on differing opinions. So First Amendment became convenient for them. And it was a disdain for First Amendment if it was language they didn't like. And the funny thing about the First Amendment is we generally only have to protect language that people don't like, right? I mean, if everybody likes the language, it doesn't have to be protected. So So there's such disdain. That's just one example of them sort of taking over, different types of language. Another one is reimagining our police, reimagining law enforcement. And what does reimagine mean? You break the law, there must be consequences and they must be enforced, or people will continue sort of escalating that behavior. I mean, that's how we're raised by our parents, is you have to have those guidelines. Why do you think there is such disdain from the left? I mean, I'm sorry to go on in this question, but I want to kind of set it up for you pretty well. The Electoral College, they've taken over what the Electoral College means on how we elect a president. We don't have a popular vote by the nation, but we do have a popular vote by state. So they've overtaken that, because anytime they've lost, they have said, well, it's because of the Electoral College. The other one is ignoring Supreme Court decisions. And then the ones they don't like, now they've decided to reform the Supreme Court, which is totally unconstitutional. In the end, their philosophy is, I don't know which way it goes. The means justifies the ends, or the ends justifies the means. But that's kind of how they approach things. So why this disdain for a country that has given everybody so much, or can provide the opportunity for us to have so much?
Well, I think in the end, it's because they're totalitarians at heart. I think they have totalitarian instincts, which is why they want what we call a pure democracy. Our founders, for example, wanted a republic. And the reason was, for example, I'll give you an example of things we don't vote on. We don't care what the public thinks. And that is you get to go to the church or not go to the church that you want to go to, because the First Amendment gives you freedom of religion. And it does not matter what the public votes on. Okay? Same thing with free speech. Same thing with the guarantee of due process. You can be a really unpopular individual and you can be accused of something, but you still have a right to a fair trial. And so those are, if you will, anti-democratic provisions of our Constitution. They limit the power of the majority to say, this is what we want. And the people in our nation now on the left, what they want is to be able to vote on everything. In other words, if the public doesn't like you, no fair trial for you. We saw that in New York, for example, this summer, right? And I feel like this is the problem, is our founders did not want a nation that was essentially the exercise of 3 wolves outvoting 2 sheep as to what's for dinner. And what they wanted was the populace to be in charge of the country and to guide its public policy. But they wanted to avoid the idea that everything was up for a vote. Sure, what's up for a vote? Where we should build highways, how many highways, what our basic public policies should be. But guess what? It's not up for a vote. What you want to wear, what color tie you want to wear, or if you want to wear a tie at all, or what you're going to have for dinner tonight, and what jobs you want to give your kids to do around the house to help. You know what I mean? It's, different families have different approaches. Some don't, their kids don't have any responsibilities. I had 7 kids, and we gave our kids a fair number of responsibilities. Like when they were little, they had to clean up their own toys, and then as they got a little older, they had to make their bed. And then as they got a little older still, they had a night where they would help with the dishes after dinner or something like that. Not every family has to do that. I think it worked out well for my children, and they would tell you so, because they're all kind of valued at their various employment situations as hard workers and diligent workers and so forth. But the reality is, we don't have a right to hold a vote to say, I'm sorry, we're going to put George in charge and make you raise your children as he sees fit. No, you get to choose that. And so I feel like that's part of the problem, is that they are totalitarians, because even though I think the way I did it worked out well, I have no desire to impose that on my neighbors and people, all over the country, because it's not my place. I'm perfectly happy with my religious views, but I would never want to impose them on other people. So the point is, the left is sure they're right, and they want to impose their rightness on us.
Yeah, I think that's really perceptive, realizing that the line between a pure democracy and totalitarianism, which Hayek wrote about so well in The Road to Serfdom, is a very, very fine one. In addition to what Elaine mentioned, the rhetorical tricks they have, or the language they use, they also have a rhetorical trick that I've noticed. Anytime there's a problem, societal problem, individual, community problem, the solution is always a government solution. And then whenever you try to challenge the government solution, they accuse you of not seeing the problem. So I'm trying to think of like a classic example here, but let's say the daycare issue, right? In this economy, both parents often have to work. That leaves young children unattended at the home. Daycare is quite expensive. So what's the left's immediate solution is, let's have universal daycare, empower government to do it, and tax you for it, which would be another huge abridgment of our freedoms. And when you try to push back against that, they say, you don't care for these parents in this situation. But no, I mean, I think our side would say there is a problem there, but the solution doesn't have to be a government one. There's ones that we can do on a communal level. Do you see that analysis yourself? And if so, what can our side do to push more voluntarist solutions versus big government ones?
Well, I think you make a very perceptive point and a very correct point, because all these different issues, like healthcare being expensive,
right?
The answer is, let's have government be in charge. And guess what? Now it's more expensive. And if you look around the globe, it's just not helpful. And so on some level, there are fixes, like housing's getting really expensive. But part of the reason is because the left's done a very good job of shutting down development, so that building a new house is somehow raping the environment. It's kind of like, well, robins can build nests and homes, and beavers can build dams and homes and so forth. But apparently humans can't. When we build a home, it's horrible. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the kind of stuff. And so they always create problems, and then they promise that the people who created the problems have the solutions. And I'm kind of like, that doesn't make sense to me, because in real life, smart people don't go to the problem makers to find solutions. They go to people who are good at solving problems. And let's look around the globe. This isn't just in the U.S. Like, let's start at the U.S. Where are the best jurisdictions to live? And how do we know this? The answer is, it ain't the places where the hard left, are in charge. They have runaway crime, failing schools, businesses are leaving, so the employment opportunities are diminishing. And those people are leaving and going to places where more conservative traditional views are held, because the streets are safer, the schools are better, and the job opportunities are better. But it's not just in the U.S. Look around the globe. Every single nation that has gone the way of the left has become a hellhole. You saw that in Argentina, Venezuela. You've seen this all over the globe. It's just, for that matter, you see it in Russia. It's Russia and China. The people in China are not doing well. The economy overall is big because they've got a lot of people there and so forth. But the average Chinese citizen is not doing well. They live in an oppressive society with very little freedom and opportunity. They get whatever freedom and opportunity the government chooses to give them. Mm-hmm. And that's the place that the people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have wanted to take us, and have. And that's why you see runaway inflation and you see all the problems we have. These people are problem makers, not problem solvers.
I guess the only real, we agree on so much here. If I can try to push you on a question, what I've seen from conservatives maybe over the last decade or so is a feeling of, yes, we're all for freedom. But when we're for freedom, the institutions are going to be captured by people who don't believe in freedom, people who believe in abridging our rights. And we've seen that happen over the past 10 years. So what I'm increasingly seeing out of the right is, okay, we have to fight their opposition to freedom with our vision of the state. And it's certainly more freedom than the left, but there's a lot of anti-freedom provisions in there as well. First of all, what do you think is our best path forward? Or do you think it's a mix of the two? Do you think it is this kind of, I guess for lack of a better word, new right that we're seeing recently? Or is it just this real commitment to the founding ideals that our nation was built on?
Well, I kind of feel like we need to go back to the traditions of our nation because they built a great, powerful nation where the people were free and where the people had great opportunity. And as we got better and better at making, I call this our national mission statement. I refer to that in my book as our great national mission statement, which is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that mission statement, as we did a better and better job of making that apply well, we were more and more successful. We don't make that apply very well anymore. And it's largely unimportant. In fact, we actually demonize the people who wrote that document and passed that document and made great sacrifices to make that document a truth, meaning that we were an independent nation. And so I would argue that we have to do a better job of educating people as to what history shows, what even recent history shows. If the left had the answers, then you know where the greatest places to live on earth would be?
New York City.
New York City, Chicago,
Los
Angeles, Baltimore, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Atlanta. And guess what? Those are the places that are not doing well, that people who live there are leaving and going elsewhere. And what's interesting is these are places where the left's been in charge for more than 2 generations typically. And so why isn't it getting better? If they have the answers, why aren't their schools the best schools? Why isn't their society the least crime-ridden? Why isn't the opportunities for jobs and employment the best? Why isn't housing the most affordable? They're failing on everything. And we have to do a better job of explaining that to people because at some point, I mean, there are even crazy leftists who will say, oh, well, that's because of Republicans. It's their fault. I'm like, oh, yeah. So the towns that haven't had a city council or a mayor or anything that's been a Republican in over 50 years, it's the Republicans who've messed it up. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, they're just lying sacks of rotting fecal matter, to be honest with you, when they say stuff like that.
I'm wondering, in 2010, we saw the rise of the Tea Party, which really came out of Americans getting involved, conservative Americans speaking out instead of just quietly living about their lives and showing up to vote every 4 years. They literally became activists. And the left has, I don't know if they've successfully done it, but they've come a long way to sort of tarring that group as racist. Remember, they were, I forget what Nancy Pelosi called them. Was it the fake grass? What was it called? Thank you, AstroTurf. It was AstroTurf, not grassroots, but AstroTurf. It couldn't be real that this many conservatives were coming out and speaking out and making a stand. And they were heard in that midterm election. With the Obama administration, I believe Barack Obama called it a shellacking when Republicans took over the Congress. And now there's Trump supporters, the MAGA supporters, the MAGA extremists. So they're working hard at the cult, at tarring them with that. But after this year with, as you mentioned, Trump being not getting due process. I mean, I think we saw enough people come forward on both sides, legal scholars on both sides, business leaders on both sides, business leaders pulling funds from one party and moving to another. I mean, Elon Musk, who never says anything on politics, but is strong on free speech, couldn't stay quiet over the Trump indictments and the finding of his guilt. Do you feel like we're on the precipice of another wave? I hate to call it's not a red wave, but I mean like a conservative freedom wave.
I think we could be, because I think there's a natural reaction. I would argue that the Tea Party was a reaction to the extremism and the leftism of the Obama administration. And because I think as an American, a lot of Americans are busy raising children, they're busy running a small business, they're busy with their jobs. And if life's going reasonably well, then your need to be civically involved feels less needful. It's kind of like if you're really healthy, you're not that worried about getting to the doctor right away, right? But if you're feeling really sick and having troubles, then the doctor works its way up your priority list. And I would argue that's probably what happens civically, is that for much of our history, many Americans kind of feel like, it's going reasonably well. And, I don't know that people who, for example, didn't vote for John F. Kennedy were freaked out that he won, because back then there wasn't this extremism. We didn't go back and forth kind of crazy extremes, but now we do. And so I think now people are waking up and they feel more involved, and it's moved up their priority list. So I'm hoping that in the election this fall, that Americans, and I'm first and foremost somebody who believes in our Constitution and in the principles of freedom and opportunity. And so that means I typically am, obviously a Republican, but the reality is if the Republican Party becomes the party of big government, if the Republican Party were to become the party of high taxes and regulation and so forth, then I'd abandon it, because I am first and foremost interested in a nation that's built on the ideals of our founding. And so as a result, I'm hoping that we have a lot of success for that. And that probably right now, given our current circumstances, would be Republicans. But I also understand maybe another generation, who knows what happens to any party. We've had parties that come and go throughout our history. We don't have the Whig Party anymore, for example, and things like that. But I think I'm interested in principles, not a party per se. That doesn't mean I don't support the Republican Party. I do. I've actually run for office as a Republican. I'm just saying that what drives me is these principles of our founding: freedom, opportunity for all, the idea of the rule of law, the idea that we have a great national mission statement that has guided our nation, and we ought to stick with it. We ought not abandon it. That'd be a really, really bad thing, to abandon the idea that all men are created equal. And as someone could say, well, what do you mean men? It's like, well, that's the generic idea of mankind, okay. that all mankind is created equal. And as a father of both sons and daughters, I love them the same. And I have hopes and aspirations for all of them. And as I raised them, I wanted them all to be able to achieve their dreams and to be, and I think to myself, who wouldn't want that to be our societal goal? And the answer is the left doesn't. They want power for themselves. An example would be they're the ones that say, women athletes don't really get to, particularly in sports where size and body mass are an advantage, that somehow we're going to dismiss them. And I think to myself, wait a minute. My daughters were really good athletes, but I'm not sure they could compete in basketball against a 6'11", 300-pound dude, even though they were really good. You know what I mean? So I feel like we have to it's the same thing as a boxer, a male boxer who weighs 150 pounds isn't going to compete well with a boxer who weighs 250 pounds. So we have weight classes. Yep. And so the point, I guess, is we've got to get back to an idea where people matter, the freedom and opportunity that they have matter, and government power is not the way to get there.
Well, the book is Let Freedom Ring Again. Tell our audience where they can find out more about you and the book, and where they can go to purchase it.
Absolutely. Well, here's a copy of it, Let Freedom Ring Again. And they can get it at Barnes & Noble's website. They can get it at Amazon, Apple's iBooks, Kindle, any of those places. You just look for Let Freedom Ring Again, and you can type in my name, Landrith, and it'll pop up. And hopefully a lot of people I admire a lot have said good things about the book. An example, Rand Paul said some really nice things about it, and I think he's been a good champion of freedom. So have others, and I'm hopeful that Americans will read it. Even people I wrote it in a way I was hoping to convince not just people who already agree with me, but to have it be well enough written and argued that a person who's perhaps leaning a little to the left might go, whoa, yeah, he makes some good points. And then wake them up and have them realize that maybe they've gotten off track. I realize that it's not going to convince a Nancy Pelosi or a Kamala Harris. Those people are a lost cause. But most of Americans, I don't believe, are. I have a number of friends who, for example, voted for Biden. My hope is that they wake up and go, yeah, this didn't turn out quite the way I planned. Maybe I shouldn't have allowed the fact that a guy occasionally tweeted annoying things become the primary reason I voted. Maybe I should vote for more prescient, important points.
Well, you make a lot of good points, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. It's Let Freedom Ring Again, and our audience can get that at Amazon or wherever they buy books from. George, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you to our audience for taking the time to listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll be back soon with another episode soon.